Michelle Platt, and I am from Brightmont Academy in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. And then I also have Jenny Sorensen, and she's also in Minnesota, coming from Plymouth. And today we're really excited for this webinar. We will have the chat open, and if you feel, it's a sensitive topic, if you feel like you don't want to chat, you can reach out to any of us afterwards and ask some questions, but hopefully people will engage in the chat. We'll have lots of helpful information. We're also going to be sending the recording to anyone who RSVP'd, so you'll get the deck along with anything else that was mentioned in this webinar. And so first I'm going to introduce, Lindsay, because she's going to be your contact. So if you do have questions or want to know more about the Emily program, they're in several states, and Sarah can go through that too. So even though we're in Minnesota, they may be in a state near you. So Lindsay is the provider specialist. She's also your point of contact. Her information will be in the chat, so definitely reach out to her. And then we have Dr. Sarah Olson, and she is a licensed psychologist based in St. Paul, Minnesota. She works with adolescents at the Emily program. She's a clinical manager. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some other things, but she has an impressive bio, and this is definitely her wheelhouse. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to answer your questions, give you an overview. If you like this webinar and there's something else you want to know more about, also put that in the chat, because maybe there's a part two. We've done that. And then definitely join us for our monthly webinar speaker series every month.
Right. Thanks, Michelle. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm so grateful to Brightmont for hosting this conversation and to everybody here for taking part in it. So thanks for being here with us. And like Michelle said, I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So please feel free to drop those in the chat. All right, getting started, I want to touch on our objectives here. We want to be focused on learning about the different types of eating disorders today, learning signs and symptoms related to each eating disorder, a little bit about the language to use with your child around food and about bodies to help them develop a healthy relationship with those. We'll learn some at-home interventions and ways to support a kid who's struggling, and then ending on learning about some resources and treatment that are available for support. I like to start out presentations with some essential facts about food, bodies, and disordered eating to just get us all on the same page as we dive into things. So, first of all, really important to recognize that eating disorders can and do impact anyone. I think a lot of us, when imagining someone with an eating disorder, envision a thin, young, white girl or woman, which often is the case, of course, but it's essential to recognize that eating disorders impact every group of people, and how they show up in different communities might look different. We often see actually that folks who don't fit into that stereotypical eating disorder mold sometimes get their symptoms missed or don't get diagnosed or screened in the same way that people who do fit that stereotypical mold do. And sometimes we see those people getting less access to treatment because of that. So oftentimes men, people of color, people in larger bodies have eating disorders that go unnoticed for longer periods of time. And for people in different groups, there can be different things that contribute to their eating disorder developing and different risk factors. So there's been a lot of research recently into how people in different minority groups who experience stress of marginalization or discrimination, that can increase the likelihood of them developing an eating disorder as a way of trying to cope with that. So just important to recognize they can impact anybody. And secondly, not everybody with an eating disorder is clinically underweight, and you can't tell if somebody has an eating disorder just by looking at them. A recent study showed that actually, I think it was less than 6% of people with eating disorders kind of fit into that underweight, clinically underweight category, or that idea of having more of an emaciated looking body. And so it's important to recognize that, if you see a significant weight change or weight loss in your child or someone that can be a sign of disordered eating, also important to recognize that that's not always present, and to be aware of other indicators that somebody might be struggling as well. Next, want to note that what a healthy body looks like is different for everybody, and everybody's body is healthy at a different size. So at the Emily program, we talk a lot about body diversity and recognizing there's a whole spectrum of different natural healthy body sizes and shapes, just like people have naturally different heights. And we know that that's largely impacted. Our height is largely shaped by our genetics, and our body size and weight is actually really similar too. So Bodies usually function best at the size and the shape that come naturally to it, or the body's natural set point. And in the eating disorder treatment world for adolescents, we really focus on understanding the growth curve an adolescent was on prior to their eating disorder and helping them to get back into that natural range for their individual body rather than focusing on like quote unquote normal BMI range. I think it's important to name too that teenagers with eating disorders aren't just going through a phase, and it's probably not something that's going to get better on its own. Oftentimes, I think it's normal to hope that maybe it's just sort of something that a kid is experimenting with. And while that can be the case, oftentimes assuming you're hoping that it's a phase can lead to a lack of early intervention. And early intervention can be so important when it comes to disordered eating. The earlier we get in there and try to counteract the disordered eating that's going on, the more we can prevent longer term harm and improve recovery outcomes. So usually not just a phase, and early intervention can really help with that. Also sad, but really important to note, I think that eating disorders are really dangerous and they can cause long-term harm. So symptoms of eating disorders can have serious consequences for the brain and the body. A couple areas I listed there: bones, heart, kidney, digestion, and reproductive health can all be impacted negatively in the long term with really severe disordered eating. We also see a lot of worsening mental health symptoms or exacerbation of already existing mental health issues alongside eating disorders. And important to note that they actually have the second highest mortality rate of any mental health disorder only after opioid addiction. So I think that can be kind of a shocking fact, but really important to keep in mind when we think about how important treatment can be. Really can be life-saving for a lot of people. And last but not least of our essential facts, you don't need to be, quote unquote, ready to recover in order to benefit from treatment. So a lot of people with eating disorders, especially children and adolescents, don't fully grasp the seriousness of their eating disorder or the potential risks, or they might really feel like they like their eating disorder or feel like it helps them to cope, and they're not really in a place of wanting to let go of it. But while it's great to express a willingness and a readiness to recover, that can be a positive sign. Treatment really doesn't need to wait for somebody to be like ready in order to benefit from it. Like we mentioned before, it's got a better prognosis when we start at a younger age for treatment. So it's important to start getting help as soon as possible, even if, your kid or adolescent doesn't feel 100% on board with recovery. And at the Emily program, we really consider it to be, for minor children or adolescents, really the caregiver's role to step in and help their kid towards recovery when the kid's not capable of making that choice for themselves. So with all of those essential facts with us, I want to transition into talking a little bit about the different types of eating disorders. There's really 5 main eating disorders that we'll cover today, listed out here. The first one you probably heard of, anorexia nervosa. That's characterized by restriction of energy intake or food, leading to significant low body weight, an intense fear of gaining weight, and misperception of one's body weight or size, usually thinking that the person themselves is bigger than they actually are. Then we've got bulimia nervosa, which is recurrent binge episodes followed by recurrent inappropriate compensatory behaviors, or what we might consider purging or compensating for the food eaten. Oftentimes that's in the form of purging or vomiting, but we also see like abuse of laxatives or overexercise as a way of trying to compensate for food eaten. The third one on there is binge eating disorder. So that's the recurrent episodes of binge eating without the compensatory purging behavior. And binge eating is characterized by eating significantly large amounts of food eaten quickly with a feeling of lack of control and strong feelings of guilt or disgust alongside that. And then after that, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, also known as ARFID. This one I think is lesser known, but we're learning a lot more about it in recent years and seeing an increase in people getting diagnosed with it as there's more of like a recognition in the culture about what it is. So that's where a person's not getting enough nutrition, but it's not related to wanting to change their body or to lose weight, not having that body image piece in there. So there's a couple different subtypes of ARFID. One can be a lack of interest in eating or in food, or just not getting hunger cues or thinking to eat. Another one can be avoidance of food based on sensory characteristics like tastes or textures, leading to not getting enough nutrition because we're avoiding a lot of different food tastes and textures. And another one can also be concern about aversive consequences of eating, usually really significant fear of vomiting that leads to avoiding eating. So again, ARFID is sort of the catch-all category for disordered eating that is not due to wanting to change one's body or lose weight. And then the last one on here, other specified feeding or eating disorder, OSFED. This is the most common diagnosis by far because it's this sort of category to capture when an eating disorder is present, but it doesn't fully meet the diagnostic criteria of any of the other eating disorders. So a really common subtype within other specified feeding or eating disorder is atypical anorexia, which is where someone has all the symptoms of anorexia, other than maybe not having lost a significant amount of weight or not having lost enough weight to be considered fully meeting that anorexia criteria. So OSFED, we see a lot of those diagnoses here at residential treatment, and we consider it just as serious as the other disorders, even though I think the label can feel like sort of this confusing one for a lot of folks. I want to note as well that there is a whole spectrum of disordered eating, taking us all the way on the right side there. You see clinical eating disorders. That's when you're diagnosed with a kind of a full-blown eating disorder. And then to the left of that, we've got disordered eating, where maybe you've got a element of disorder in your relationship with food or even your body, but it doesn't quite meet all the criteria to be a diagnosable eating disorder. Further on the left there, you've got maybe a stressful relationship with food or a lot of diet culture approach in the relationship to food. And then all the way on the left, we've got, of course, what is our goal, which is having a peaceful relationship with food. I like to name this because I think there's a lot of ways we can see kids struggling in their relationship with food and deserving help and care for that, even if they aren't diagnosed with an eating disorder. I think the prevention tips that we'll talk about today can help those kids just as much. Right. Now I want to transition into talking a little bit more about some of the causes that can contribute to eating disorders and some of the risk factors. So we utilize in the eating disorder world this biopsychosocial model to describe and visualize how there's always many different things and different areas that contribute to an eating disorder developing. It's really never just one thing that causes somebody to have an eating disorder. So in the upper right area, we've got the biological influences. There's been so much research in the last 10 years about how large a role genes and family history can play in predisposing somebody to an eating disorder. In the lower right-hand area, we've got the psychological factors relating to somebody's beliefs and mental predisposition. So temperamental traits, kind of, the personality you might see in your kid from birth. There are certain traits like maybe being more sensitive overall, or maybe having a predisposition to being more impulsive. There's some traits like that that can be more likely for somebody to develop an eating disorder. If somebody's got a high degree of anxiety or other mental health diagnoses like depression, that can also make an eating disorder more likely. A history of trauma can also be an element. And then that internalization of the thin ideal is really key too. And that really speaks to, how much does somebody believe that like a thin body is better, or, thinness is really important to me. Of course, how strongly they feel that is also going to play a role in whether or not they develop an eating disorder. And then on the left side here, we see those social factors. These are probably a lot of the things we think about when we think about who's getting an eating disorder and what triggers it. And those are the things influenced by our society, community, family, etc. Oftentimes, kids at school can play a role too when it comes to like bullying or weight pressure. So some of those include dieting or like a diet culture, having exposure to weight stigma or bias, or some pressures, comments, teasing, bullying when it comes to weight. That can be a serious trigger. Media messages and what we're seeing in the media we consume about bodies and about food. Other things like life stressors or life transitions, even if they're not related to, food or body image, can be a trigger if somebody's already got the biological and the psychological underpinnings. Going through a really stressful time might be a thing that can trigger the beginning of disordered eating. And then some other elements like food insecurity or experiences of discrimination, like we mentioned earlier, can also contribute to disordered eating too. So again, in folks with eating disorders, we can usually see how elements of all three of these areas came together to create the conditions or sort of the perfect storm for an eating disorder to develop. Another model I find really helpful in understanding eating disorder development is the three Ps. So first, we've got the predisposing factors, which are those pre-existing pieces that might lead to someone being more susceptible to an eating disorder developing, like the genetic predisposition or an anxious temperament. One of the biggest predisposing factors can be having a degree of body dissatisfaction. That's something that we see just really rampant, unfortunately, in teenagers today. So recent study found that 53% of US teen girls reported being unhappy with their bodies by 13, and that grew all the way up to 78% by age 17. So that, dissatisfaction with the body really is going to put folks in a place of being maybe predisposed to some disordered eating developing. Then we've got the precipitating factors, which are those that trigger the eating disorder to actually start, like being bullied at school or learning how to count calories in health class, or starting to diet can be a really, really big precipitating risk factor as well that I want to call out here. Another recent study showed that more than 50% of teen girls are dieting, and more than a quarter of teen boys report active dieting. So that is another one of those big red flags to look out for that can really be the beginning of disordered eating. And then lastly, the perpetuating factors are the ones that cause an eating disorder to continue after it started. That could include things like someone being told their body looks really good or that they look better after losing weight, and then they want to keep doing it. Or they might find that restriction makes them feel more of a sense of control, and they really like that. Those are the things that can kind of keep the eating disorder going. I like to talk about the three Ps model because it can help us parse out where we can intervene to prevent eating disorders. And we know we might not be able to control most of the predisposing factors, and we can't control our genetics, but we can have a really positive impact on the precipitating and the perpetuating factors, and that there's so many things that we can do to help kids develop healthy relationships to their food and their bodies.
Hey, Sarah, can you
Yeah.
share with us? You shared some really good stats about the percentage of teens actively dieting. Do you feel like there's been an increase in the amount of teens dieting? Michelle has a comment in our chat about, hey, you've got TikTok, you've got videos, you've got, with social media, we're always talking about social media and its influence. Do you feel like those percentages have gone up recently, or is that maybe has always been the standard and we're just more in tune with it? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. And I think it's one of those where it's really hard to know. And I think it's probably a little bit of both. Just like we are seeing more eating disorder diagnoses, we're seeing more dieting, we're seeing more in continually increasing degree of body image dissatisfaction. And it's hard to know, are our tools for measuring it getting better? Are we asking more of the right questions to more of a variety of different people, or are these things really getting significantly worse? We talk a lot about social media, and it's sort of this ever evolving landscape. There's always going to be different ways for kids to kind of get in touch with the wrong sort of information about food and about bodies. And it's hard to know. Um, yeah, how much is it really getting worse versus how much are they just getting their information from different places? But I think social media and especially TikTok these days is playing a really big role in misinformation and how kids are exposed to social media. And I think the thing that's really changed the most in the world of social media is just how consistent the exposure to those things are. You know, when they were getting those messages through magazines or through television, it just wasn't the sort of around the clock messaging coming at them from every direction. So I think the pervasiveness of the message is really the thing that's changed the most with the social media world we're in now. That's a great question. And I'm hopeful, you know, there's always more research coming out and you know, I think there's probably a lot of people out there right now on TikTok trying to learn about how these messages are spreading to kids. And I'm hopeful we'll have even more strategies for intervening in those in years to come. Thanks for that question. I want to move now into talking a little bit more about prevention of eating disorders and ways to develop healthy relationships with our kids to their bodies and to eating. I'm going to break it down into two segments. First, prevention strategies regarding bodies and weight, and then moving into prevention strategies around food and eating next. For each of the tips, I'm going to give ideas of what to do, what not to do, and then some quotations with examples of each of those. So first, bodies and weight. Number one is to be mindful about how you discuss your own body and weight around your child, and be mindful about not commenting on or discussing the weight of other people. So instead, we can focus on what bodies can do versus what they look like. We might want to avoid saying things like, "Ugh, I hate how my stomach looks. I wish I could lose some weight." And instead try focusing on things like I love how my legs, they're strong and they allow me to take these long walks with you and the dog. I love doing that. Or talking about how bodies can change and that doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? So we might say, I notice, you know, as I get older, my body's changing more. I think I'm going to get some new clothes that are more comfortable versus modeling, trying to change our body to fit into the clothes that we have. The second one there is to avoid equating health and weight, like we talked about before, recognizing that they're not as closely linked as we previously thought, and we can focus on other markers to determine and understand our physical health, like the lab work or the vitals that we get done at the doctor. Instead, we want to recognize that every body is healthy at a different size, and that that's largely determined by our genetics. So we might want to avoid saying things like, well, you know, Aunt Becky is unhealthy because she weighs so much, and instead help kids understand that body diversity means all bodies are different and healthy at different sizes, and we can highlight that to kids. Number three is to avoid encouraging exercise for weight loss purposes, and instead to encourage movement that your child authentically enjoys and that supports physical and mental health, balanced with time for rest and relaxation. So we might want to avoid saying things like, you know, you should go to the gym more. You're looking kind of chubby, or you look like you gained weight. Let's go to the gym. And instead try pointing out what they enjoy about their activities. I love how much you enjoy soccer. It's so fun to run around with your friends. Let's make sure you fuel up before practice to get enough energy. And the last one here, if your child is being bullied for appearance or for their size or weight, avoid discussing weight loss as a way to cope with that situation or to protect themselves. And instead, help your child realize there's nothing wrong with their body, and it's never okay to discriminate based on looks. So avoid saying things like, you know, maybe you should lose weight so then the bullies will leave you alone, which puts the onus on the child to change the situation. Instead, saying things like, you know, it's never okay to make fun of how somebody looks. I'm going to talk to the principal about it. You're perfect the way you are, and your body is none of their business. Next, moving into some tips on building and supporting a healthy relationship with food and eating. Number one, trying to avoid restrictive thinking or talk around food, like forbidding certain types of food, because this can lead to greater restriction and disordered eating down the road. And or it can also create a desire to have more of those foods that kids are hearing are forbidden or are fully off limits. Instead, it can help to recognize that all foods contain a variety of nutrients and our body knows how to use them. So we call that our all foods fit philosophy at the Emily program, and try to focus on how can we get a balance of different foods without making anything off limits? So it helps to avoid language like, you can't eat that, you can't have it, I won't allow that in the house, we don't eat that. And try language like, sure, you can have some chips or you can have some of what it is you're wanting. Let's have a sandwich too with those chips to add some balance into our meal. Number two is to avoid labeling foods in an all or nothing way, using labels like healthy or unhealthy or good or bad. Because when we label foods as bad, it can lead us to label ourselves as bad when we eat them, rather than having a morally neutral relationship to what we eat. Instead, it can help to utilize concepts like balance, moderation, and variety rather than all or nothing language. So avoiding saying things that connect food and morality, like I'm trying to be good and not eat any cookies this week, or even saying such and such food is so unhealthy. Instead, we can try focusing on my body feels best when I pay attention to what I'm hungry for and what helps me feel good. Right now, I want something sweet after dinner, so I'm going to have some ice cream. Kind of role modeling that, listening to our body and what it's wanting, rather than making our choices of food based off of good or bad or healthy, unhealthy. And last in this category is to avoid pushing more food than one is hungry for outside of eating disorder treatment. Sometimes we have to work on eating even when we're not feeling hungry in eating disorder treatment, but at home, that's usually not as helpful. And avoid removing access to food. Instead, helping kids learn to honor their authentic hunger and fullness cues. So we might avoid saying things like, you can't be hungry again, you just ate an hour ago, or you have to finish everything on your plate before you leave. Instead, we can use language like, what are you feeling hungry for right now? I'm feeling hungry for a granola bar. I'm going to get one to give me energy to last until dinner time. Again, role modeling that, feeding our bodies and helping us have consistent intake throughout the day to honor our hunger and fullness cues. And that role modeling can really be key when it helps to show kids how to do it themselves. All right. Next, let's move into talking a little bit more about what to look out for and some red flags to be aware of when it comes to potential eating disorder symptoms. First, in the area of bodies and weight, it's essential to look out for changes in body focused behavior, like looking in the mirror more often, making more negative body comments, weighing themselves more often, talking about wanting to lose weight. Those can be some red flags for a more disordered relationship with their body. Looking out for significant changes in weight. Of course, kids and adolescents sometimes have some drastic changes in weight that can be a really normal part of puberty and growing up. So this isn't always necessarily going to mean they definitely have an eating disorder, but if there's a significant change, it's a good thing to kind of keep an eye on what's going on with food as well. Changes in movement or exercise habits, especially if they seem appearance motivated or directed towards losing weight, or if they are really rule based, like we sometimes see kids saying, I have to work out every single day, or I can only eat dinner if I go to the gym first. A sort of rules based relationship to movement can be a sign of a disordered eating and body image. Sometimes wearing baggy or loose fitting clothes can be a sign of a kid trying to hide their body because they're feeling more self-conscious, or maybe trying to hide that they've lost some weight and they don't want anybody to notice. Of course, that might just be your kid's style too. So looking out for more of just like a change in that area can be important. And then lastly, looking out for physical changes or reports of physical changes from your kid, like fatigue, lack of energy, dizziness, chest pains, coldness, hair loss. All of those can be signs of their body reacting to disordered eating. Then around food and eating, things to look out for include eating less than usual, skipping meals that they used to eat, or they say that they're eating, but you don't see them eat as often as before. Oftentimes we'll see kids saying things like, oh, I ate a big lunch at school, so I don't need a snack, or I ate with my friend when I got home from school, so I'm not hungry for dinner now. Sometimes things like that can go on for a while before you might realize, I don't think I've actually seen my kid eat very much in the last couple of weeks. So good to kind of keep an eye out for what are you actually witnessing when it comes to them eating. Being secretive around food, hiding food, or not eating around others. We see a lot of kids come into treatment feeling very self-conscious about eating with other people, which is why we practice eating in community here and trying to get back to that sort of social part of eating too. Changes in eating habits, like trying new diets, cutting out certain foods or food groups completely. Um, that can be a really important thing to look out for since we talked about dieting being a huge risk factor when it comes to development of disordered eating. Excessive discussion around food or dieting, sometimes to the degree of seeming like really obsessed with it, can be a red flag. Counting calories or counting other elements of nutrition like carbohydrates or proteins or fats can be a red flag. Frequently going to the bathroom after meals. You notice that your kid's disappearing a lot right after eating, could be a warning sign of potential purging behavior. And then ritualistic behaviors around eating or seeming like they're eating in really specific or strange seeming ways, like eating foods in order, taking foods apart and eating them piece by piece, not touching foods like finger foods with their hands and using silverware instead. Um, again, every kid is different, and these things might be totally normative for your kid, but if you're seeing these behaviors pop up for the first time, it's a good thing to be curious about. I like to use this visual aid to highlight how, if we're seeing a couple small warning signs, it's often the case that a kid is experiencing a lot of hidden distress and anxiety, even obsession about food in their body that they're not aware of, that we're not aware of. So even if it doesn't seem like there's a lot of signs, it's important to take those seriously if you're starting to notice a couple of them.
Can I go back? Can I just ask you about the ritualistic? So
Absolutely.
is it is it almost a way of hiding the eating disorder, like taking it apart and all that? Like what's going on when they're using
Sure.
doing those things?
Totally. It can be a lot of different things. Sometimes it is a behavior that is sort of a expression of how they feel about the food. Like if you have a kid who's like really fidgety when they're anxious, it's sort of like can be fidgeting with food as a way to express the anxiety. It can be I feel more in control of it when I eat it in the way that I'm comfortable with. Like if I'm eating all my green beans first and then I'm eating my potato. It's sometimes when the restriction or the disordered eating symptoms start, um, it changes the way that our brain thinks about food and you can start to see these sort of odd behaviors as sort of a side effect of that. So it's different when it comes to each kid, but if they're experiencing a lot of like fear of food too, like avoiding touching it or avoiding eating things that are mixed together is just one of the ways that comes across. And again, it's different for every kid. You might not see those things with your kid if they or with every kid with an eating disorder, but can be one of those things that if you notice it, it's just good to ask some more questions and get curious about it. Right. So now I want to talk a little bit about what to do when you notice a problem with your kid's relationship to food or to their body. First step is really trying to talk to your child about it. It's so normal to be nervous about that conversation or to feel kind of awkward going into it. And just important to remember that saying something about disordered eating is critical. It's really the first step towards getting some help, and that your intervention is a gift, even if your kid's acting like it's the last conversation in the world that they want to have. I can really help to use a non-judgmental, calm approach with open-ended questions to focus on what you've noticed and your concern for their well-being. And remember, above all, that your goal is to offer support and to collaborate on a plan to get some help. You might see that your kid is really determined to avoid intervention or detection. They might say, I'm fine, it's not a big deal. Or, I know it's a problem, but I've got it. I'm handling it by myself. And it's important to stay focused on what you're noticing, why you're concerned, rather than trying to argue about the details of it or try to really convince them that this is as serious of a problem as you see it as. So a couple examples for that. Some ways to approach the conversation that might not be so helpful include saying things like, you've lost too much weight. I keep telling you to eat, but you won't listen to me. We can see how that sort of getting worked up and not starting from that calm place, making it feel like an accusation of the kid. That's going to cause them to have more of a defensive approach probably and bring up more reactivity in them. It's not going to get us into that productive conversation we want to have. Saying things like, there is too a problem, you're not fine, everybody can see that you have a problem. Getting us caught up in that arguing about whether or not there is an issue is going to keep us distracted from focusing on getting the help that we need. The third example there, saying you never eat what I make you for dinner, even though I put so much time and effort into it. This is a problem for the whole family. Getting caught up in that guilt and blame also is going to distract us from moving forward and getting some help. And is probably going to make the kid feel really bad in the process, which isn't our goal. And then the last not so helpful approach is, as long as you feel okay, I'll leave you alone. There's only a problem if you think there is, because we know kids might want to avoid treatment. They might say that things are fine when they're not actually, and leaving it in their hands might not actually help us get them into the kind of support that they're needing. A couple more helpful examples of ways we could approach the conversation could be to say, I've noticed changes in your eating that have caused me to be concerned. I know you've been going through a lot of stress at school, and I'm worried that it's impacting your relationship with food. We might also say, seems like you carry yourself differently and you haven't been enjoying the activities you used to. Tell me more about how you've been feeling lately. And the last example, I'm really concerned about your eating. I want us to check in with a professional about what to do. I hear you saying you think you're fine, you can handle it yourself, but I know these sorts of things can be really hard to handle on your own. Let's just start with a phone call to get some more information. You can kind of see how each of those starts from a calm place, keeps it focused on what we're noticing and that we're concerned, and keeps things moving towards getting some kind of support. I think validation is a really key part too, saying, you've been going through a lot of stress, or, it seems like you've been struggling with this thing, can help kids feel really seen in that conversation. After you've broached the topic with your child, the next steps are to talk to a professional. You might want to start with your primary care doctor if you've got a good relationship with them and if they know your child pretty well. You can also consider seeing an eating disorder specialist. With the Emily program, you can do a phone screener and they can help you determine if eating disorder treatment is recommended for your child. And I want to name too that just not putting off treatment if treatment is recommended or they're diagnosed with an eating disorder, again, is really important, as that early intervention helps a lot. And the longer we wait to get treatment, often the worse things are, and the longer treatment takes by the time we get started with it.
Dr. Olson,
Mhm.
what do you do with a child or your kid when you bring up, what you're noticing and those using that helpful language and
Mhm.
you get denial? You get, I don't have a problem. That's not
Mhm.
happening. What you're seeing doesn't matter. Or it's not, that's not what it is. What do you do then?
Great question. And unfortunately, no 100% effective answer, right? I think it really depends on the situation. If you're starting to notice some signs and they're telling you, no, that's not what's going on, it can be a good first step to say, like, okay, like I hear you, and I'm going to be keeping a closer eye on this because I want to make sure that like it is the case that you're not struggling with this, and I'm here to support you. So let's do some more meals together, or let's make sure we're having snack together after school every day, or I'm going to go with you when you take a walk with the dog because I've got concerns that you're using that as a time to overexercise. Keeping a closer eye in a supportive way could be a good place to start. If it seems like it really is pretty extensive and you're noticing a lot of those red flags, it could be appropriate to say, I hear you. I want to believe that everything is totally fine. And I am so concerned that I really think we need to take the step of calling somebody. We do see plenty of kids come into treatment who are fighting against it every step of the way, but by the end of treatment, even if they don't, we do see some kids who throughout their time in treatment maintain that I was fine, I didn't need the help, but their parents can see the difference when they come out of treatment and
Hmm.
see their kid having a um, healthier relationship with food and their body and really getting back into that healthy place that they were at before the eating disorder. So again, ideally kids are on board with treatment and they see that there's a problem, but it is important to take those steps towards healing even if the kid is not fully on board.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And then we do have a question from the chat. If you're a teacher or you're an educator, you're in a school environment and you notice some of these, telltale signs or some of these things that happen that make you suspect a student is struggling with an eating disorder.
Mhm.
What do you do first? Do you have a conversation with the child? Do you immediately go to the parent? Is there the right way to do it? Is it a situational issue? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another one where I think it does depend on the situation and again, maybe your relationship to the kid and the kid's relationship to the eating disorder. I think I think it's often okay to try something and then see how that works and then try something else, sort of a take it step by step kind of thing. So maybe talking about it with the kid first, if there's somebody that you've got a good relationship with and they tend to be pretty open with you. And hopefully that can be a productive conversation. I think always looping parents in is really important because they might be seeing things at home, that you're not aware of at school, or it could be they're seeing some concerning things at home and they're not sure, and you're seeing some concerning things at school, but you're not sure. But when we put those conversations together, it gives us a fuller picture of a kid who's really struggling across the board. So I would say talking to the parent, I think, is always a good first step. And, whether you start there or you start with the kid, I think really depends on your relationship with them. But always that collaborative approach between school support and home support, I think really gives us the best chance at getting a holistic picture and support for those next steps with the kid. Lastly, in this presentation, I want to share a little bit more about what you can expect if you pursue treatment for your child. Eating disorder treatment is really designed to do all of the following to help clients eat and be active, in tune with their body's needs, to eat a variety of foods without fear, to decrease or stop use of unhealthy symptoms like purging, restore or stabilize weight if needed, to increase physical health and well-being, appreciate their body differently, think critically about media messages, disentangle the ED voice or the ED self, eating disorder self, from authentic self and embracing one's true values, and to grow and practice adaptive coping skills rather than utilizing the eating disorder to cope. Treatment always employs both a top down, changing our thoughts and our mind to change our behaviors, as well as a bottom up, changing our behaviors in order to effectively change our thinking. We use both of those strategies in treatment. I always like to mention that because we get a lot of questions about, why do we focus so much on food when that's what the kid's really struggling with? Shouldn't we help them have a better relationship with food before we start trying to engage in more different fear foods? Well, doing the both at once, practicing eating to help us learn that food doesn't have to be scary and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. That really helps kids learn to think differently about it. Just at the same time, we're working on those cognitive aspects in therapy and in group. Adolescent eating disorder treatment also always includes a really strong emphasis on family involvement and caregiver support, and really empowering caregivers to take the lead in feeding their child and helping them recover. And it also involves an emphasis on getting a client's body and nutrition back on track to support that continued development that is happening so quickly in adolescent years. And the care team can really vary in different levels of treatment, but always involves a therapist and a registered dietitian, as well as a medical provider and a psychiatrist. And how those folks work together and how often they see your child is really going to depend on the level of care you're in. This shows us a little bit more about the different levels of care. This is what it looks like in the Emily program. And a lot of places sort of follow this model. So on the far left side there, we've got outpatient treatment. That could be, once a week therapy, once a week meeting with the dietitian for a half hour, and then up through the levels of intensity. So in the middle there, we've got our day programming, which sort of functions like school, where a client lives at home but comes into programming during the weekdays. Into residential, which is the level that I work at, where we've got a facility where clients live 24 hours a day, and they're medically supervised. And it's more of a behaviorally intensive program as well, up to inpatient, which is more like a hospital. So our residential is more of a homey setting. Inpatient is more like hospitalization for kids who are really physically on the edge and need that full-time support.
Dr. Olson, there is another question.
Great.
So, I'm curious about a medically complex child. My daughter has a seizure disorder that requires some intense medication that makes her hungrier and is known to cause weight gain. She's definitely aware of this and it makes her uncomfortable, but also on another necessary medicine that decreases her appetite. So at times she feels nauseous and is unwilling to eat, and then she'll get ravenous at other times. Regardless, this feels unhealthy, is on her mind and impacting her confidence. So any recommendations?
Yeah, great questions. We see a lot of kids with really complex medical backgrounds too. It is so tricky when you're on multiple medications with those conflicting effects. I think it sounds like, and having a care team, a therapist and a dietitian who can kind of provide recommendations about how to support eating over the long term, I think would be really helpful. But it sounds like helping her kind of regulate relationship with food, finding ways to eat when she's not feeling hungry, since, we still need that nutrition, even if we're not really like craving something or not really feeling like we want to eat. Oftentimes that can help. We sort of see that the restrict and binge cycle can become a really powerful pattern for kids who aren't getting enough, or adults too, who aren't getting enough nutrition. And then later we feel so hungry, and then we feel terrible sometimes after we eat more than our body can really tolerate. So it sounds like a good place to start might be trying to like regulate the eating pattern in the day to day. And a dietitian, especially, I think could really help with that. Therapists could probably be helpful as well, but there's a lot of great techniques for, encouraging eating and following a schedule with eating, even when kids aren't feeling hungry. Great questions.